Alright guys, so I'm back for my final video 2022, and of course how can I not wrap this year up without doing a top 10 albums of the year list. And of course I only had to add in the most high quality of albums here, with Her Loss being in my top 5, Kid Carson's X making my top 3, and that weird ass Kendrick album making somewhere around 10 or something, I don't know. But regardless, it's time to finally put a bow on 2022 music and give you guys a reason to find my IP address, come to my home, and strangle me until I admit that Honestly Nevermind was a good album. But on that note, thank you guys for watching a year of the best content on YouTube, and let's get started. Alright, so for the first stop on this long-winded road trip is in Mexico City, Mexico, the birthplace of Latin alt-pop singer Girl Ultra, with her latest 7-track project El Sur. And when going through this album, I think what drags me into it the most is the energy it brings, with these more electronic pop beats such as Bombay and, bear with me here, my Spanish is shit, Amores de Droga, with lyrics mainly diving into love and heartbreak, which isn't something too crazy, but still it makes for some amazing little bops, really utilizing synths and 808s to make the more dance-centric tracks. But then at the same time you have tracks such as Punk and Nada Que Hacer that instead goes for the more pop rock sound, with nice choruses that I also enjoyed as well. But I think the main song that really dragged me into this was Jungla de Locos, with us being taken on a much slower wave with live instruments and synths being the main focus for the instrumental, while we're also given some amazing vocals alongside a nice catchy chorus that really made this one of, if not the main standout on this entire project. I mean, overall, for this to be the first time I've actually listened to Girl Ultra, what I will say is that I'm highly impressed from beginning to end, with each track being able to bring so much flair and energy that really allowed it to stand out further than most I've heard this year. So next up on the list is something that I brought up in an earlier video about Pitchfork's god-awful top 50 albums of 2022 list, which is a perfect example of why not everyone should be a music critic. But instead of throwing this project in the 30s, we're going to be bringing it all the way down to my top 10s, mainly because of how much it stayed in rotation for me, with me mainly being a sucker for ambience because it works as good background noise while I'm trying not to stress out while writing the script. But for the people who haven't heard this project, it's mainly a collection of strings and synths being tossed all across the board, both in a more unorthodox and more organized fashion, especially with tracks such as Plonk 7 and Plonk 6. But as I said in my previous video, it's how the ambience is delivered that really drags me into this project. I mean, to make the analogy, I believe I said that this album was like being lost out in sea, or maybe in a long car ride passing along trees, questioning when you'll hit your destination. And after coming off a hiatus of 6 years from its last album, for those of you who have never, and also those who have, it's good to see someone like Quarticos S still be able to shine a light on such a niche subgenre of electronic music. But overall, it's a hell of an album from beginning to end, and another reason to scare the hoes. Now next up, we gotta go right back to the Spanish, because how can we talk about Girl Ultra and not talk about the Spanish superstar Rosalia and her latest album Motomami? Now what I will say is that when getting into the meat and potatoes of this album, I wouldn't really say it's the most cohesive, mainly relying on racy lyrics, distortion, and the standard Latin pop sound to make for some pretty wild tracks such as Saoko and Diablo. But just because that was the more appealing direction on this project doesn't mean that there weren't some more Spanish influenced sounds such as flamenco and bachata on the tracks Delirio de Grandeza and Bulirias. But if we're going to get into what I liked about this album, it would have to be the overall adventurous vibe that I got from it. I mean, in comparison to her previous project El Mal Querer, this feels more like an attempt at pushing the boundaries of mainstream Spanish and Latin pop, incorporating a bit of an electronic and hip-hop flair alongside the usual 808s and hats that plague beats such as Candy and Chicken Teriyaki, and then adding the distorted vocals and more wild energy that we get throughout a good bit of this album. And it's like, instead of pushing people away, it's actually bringing in something more refreshing to the mainstream sound, and I hope that whatever she has planned in the future is able to top this, because with what I'm hearing now, it sounds like this direction has a lot of potential for the Spanish singer. Next up, we're given a good example of how a rapper's ability to, well, rap doesn't just die out, with the hip-hop veteran Nas and producer Hitboy tapping in for another collaboration in their King's Disease series, this time making what I think is their best one to date. But being accompanied with sample beats, boom bap sound, and some slick bars, King's Disease 3 is a perfect example of how to show a younger, more easily impressionable, and an older, more stubborn audience that there are multiple ranges to hip-hop, and as long as we have guys like Nas and Hitboy around to keep its roots alive, then the genre will never die or get oversaturated. I mean, the storytelling and just overall delivery across this album is absolutely amazing, with Nas going in on tracks about how black minds shouldn't always be pitted against each other, or his time growing up in the 70s and 80s trying to dodge trouble while at the same time still getting into his own deal of shady business. We're trying to encourage more black entrepreneurs and destroying that cycle of poverty, and while I know to a good bit of people it might be too preachy, but as stated before, it's the delivery that helps make this album stand out further than most, and then adding the beat switches, the old school boom bap sound, and even a blast to the past with the light feet wave that took over New York around a decade ago, and it's like this album is just another nostalgia hit for old heads and another banger for hip hop nerds. Now, next up on the list is something that was recommended to me by a friend, with them claiming that as their album of the year, and while I wanted to initially call up the cops and get this dude sent to a psych ward for saying something so stupid, I think I could probably say I was wrong, and this also ended up being one of my favorite albums of this year as well. And for the people who still don't know what I'm talking about because you dumbasses didn't read the title card, this is the latest album from the artist Kurt Vile called Watch My Moves, and I feel like in comparison to most I've heard, this has got to be my favorite rock album this year. I mean, I can't exactly place my hands on it, but it's something about this album that just gives me a much more pleasant feeling with how the guitar and drums are played, in a way being something good to relax to and really clear your mind with, alongside Kurt's more off-tune and monotone vocals being lazily tossed onto these instrumentals to make for some absolutely beautiful tracks such as Flying Like a Fast Train and Like Exploding Stones. And only having 15 tracks in total, it clocks in at a solid hour and 15 minutes, with some tracks stretching that up to 8 minutes in length of soft rock and country inspired sounds that I feel didn't even drag out simply just because how everything was executed. But I guess what I'm trying to say in the end is that if it wasn't for my dear comrade, I wouldn't have had a spot for my number 6 album of 2022. Alright, so I know I placed this album at number 5 on my list, but at the same time I would also place this album at number 1 in the most overlooked album of 2022, simply just cause how it really did come and go for a lot of people. But not for me, cause real niggas never forget a banger, and with The Weeknd's latest album, DAWN FM, I feel like I'm being transported back to the 80s with its synths and overall pop funk sound that I really did enjoy. And although the features weren't really all that good, for what it's worth, at least The Weeknd was able to consistently put his best foot forward to make some pretty good head bopping tracks such as Sacrifice and Is There Someone Else. Also having some narration from Jim Carrey to help with the radio aesthetic, this album for the most part is an undeniable banger. We get some pretty fun beats, some catchy flows and choruses, and some classic Abel verses about indulging in drugs and love that I feel just completes the blueprint for another W in his discography. I mean, to most this might not really push the envelope as much, to which they are right, because it really doesn't, but at the same time, in the same way that I see Kendrick Lamar's latest album, is how I see this project. It's not its best, but it's still damn good. Unfortunately, it just flew so low under the radar because this man didn't really do too much promo for something that was meant to be a trilogy, but whatever, I guess. You do you, Abel. Now, moving forward into my top 5, we have number 4 with the Norwegian singer-songwriter Aurora and her latest album, The Gods We Can Touch, coming out way earlier into the year and being one of the highest rated albums I've reviewed, with me giving it a high 8 out of 10. See that, guys? I'm actually capable of rating something higher than a 7 or just spending 4 minutes making fun of it. But still, when listening to this project, I feel like in comparison to most pop I've heard this year, this album really does step it up as one of the better ones, especially with the themes of love and gods being a nice direction to help keep me tied in. I mean, just beginning with the forbidden fruits of Eden and Everything Matters, they flow right into each other to make this bass and vocal heavy track with a little bit of French sprinkled in with the featuring artist Palm to make my favorite song off the album. But even so, we have tracks such as Cure For Me that takes the more catchy and dancey energy and pop music to make this more head bopping track that I also really did enjoy. But I would say one of the main tracks that caught my attention was A Dangerous Thing, that takes a turn away from the traditional pop sound to go for the more indie folk, utilizing an acoustic guitars and Aurora's vocals to make this more dramatic and Imagine Dragon style boom and clap sound, except it's actually bearable and isn't played over and over during college football. Overall, it's a hell of an album from beginning to end, and if you haven't checked it out by now, I would highly recommend it. Alright, so next up on the list of albums that talk about a bunch of nothing is number 3 with Toro Y Moi's latest album Mahal, which means love in Filipino, and I feel like perfectly signifies how nothing has to be very in-depth to be an overall great project. I mean, it's number 3 for a reason, and it's totally not because we hail from the same dogshit state, but also because I feel like when going through such a diverse discography as Toro Y Moi's, it's like I'm being once again taken on a road trip through different genres and sounds to make another hit for Chaz. I mean, from the guitar to the saxophone to the drums, it's as if instead of going for the experimental hip-hop sound with Soul Trash and the chill pop sound with Boo Boo, this time he says, fuck all that corny shit, we're doing psych rock. And I'm honestly 1000% with it. I mean, just take a listen to tracks such as Magazine and Day in Love and tell me you can't find the appeal. Like, bro, I will smack the shit out of you if you don't think this is fire. And the whole radio road trip theme that's being sprinkled on this album is definitely a highlight, and I feel it's done just a bit better than how DAWN FM tried to execute, adding little details between songs and even messing with the clarity of the rest of the album when the track Clarity comes on. And I know while lyrically this is just like Rosalia's album, in which there isn't much substance anywhere amongst what Chaz is saying, I feel like that could be completely overlooked when you just take a look at how he's able to execute at such a high caliber. I mean, overall, this album really was a fun ride, and I hope that whatever direction Chaz goes in can be on the same level as this. Alright, so I already know all you little Kendrick meat munchers are seasoned in the comments that I don't have this album at my number 1, but maybe if you got this nigga's nuts out your face, you might be able to see what the hell I'll be trying to say. But yet, the veteran MC has returned with another conscious hip-hop album called Mr. Morale and the Big Steppers, and just like as I said with DAWN FM, although this isn't his best project to date, it's still pretty damn good. I mean, from beginning to end, with all the topics that Kendrick decides to tackle on, it obviously seems like an attempt at showing growth within oneself, while at the same time still creating these more pop trap beats and catchy flows to keep the listeners entertained, even if they're not trying to be taught a lesson. From tackling issues of transphobia and homophobia to abuse, and even his own demons of addiction and cheating that damn near destroyed his relationship. As stated before, it's like Kendrick really did choose to grow up and become the better and more open-minded person in comparison to his past self, and is even calling out the black community for the same issues that we refuse to acknowledge. That's basically him giving a hats off to the people, stating how he instead chooses himself to change instead of constantly trying to tell the community their flaws, and that we need to shape up and get wiser, which I can totally respect. And then we also had some damn good features with Sampha, Baby Keem, and even Kodak Black hopping on to dish out some spoken word on Rich Interlude, and then even giving a nice verse on Silent Hill with an amazing beat that made for one of my favorite tracks from the album. I guess the only thing I wish this album had was a more notable hit song to keep this album ahead, but I guess to make something truly good, it doesn't always need a standout hit. Alright guys, get the lights going, let's get a drum roll too, because for the #1 album of 2022 is the Dreamville rapper JID and his latest project, The Forever Story. Now I know this is pretty expected, especially since just about everyone and their granddaddy had this album as their #1, but hey, since the opinion is already oversaturated, I might as well throw in my opinions as well, and try my hardest not to dick ride. But yeah, after 4 years, the Atlanta rapper has returned with The Forever Story, and to no surprise, we're given a collection of hard-hitting 808s and quick-fire bars that feels like a true showing of why JID can be claimed as one of the best modern-day rappers in the game. I mean, when making this list, I was contemplating on who could actually top JID as #1, but not even Kendrick could truly appeal to me as much as this album did, especially when you have tracks such as Radar and Dance Now that work as perfect introductions into one's growth, not just as a rapper, but as an artist in general. And even he has the ability to get a bit conscious with his bars, such as with the track Louder 2, talking about how the black image and culture are constantly being used over and over by the media for profit, and the people being tossed aside because of the labels. It was never about who held the culture, but instead about how to profit from it. And then alongside an amazing beat made by James Blake and Thundercat on a bass guitar going absolutely insane, it's like this song was just speaking to me from all angles and is now one of my favorites of 2022. But overall, this album I feel is more than just the standard hip hop piece to most, but instead a form of art utilizing the boom bap and trap sound to create a spoken word within quickfire vocals that if you're not really paying attention to, you might miss. And in comparison to the stuff Jid's put out before, I gotta say that this is the best album currently sitting in his discography, although his discog isn't really that big to begin with, but still. But that's about the rundown for my top 10 albums of 2022, and of course I'm going to link each one of these in my bio for you guys to check out and give thoughts. But aside from that, I do just want to say thank you guys for a wonderful year on this platform and allow me to reach heights I never thought possible. And although the number is small now, in the near future I believe Wallow's music review will be the next one up, so you just gotta believe. But if you liked the video, feel free to subscribe as well, follow my IG and Twitter, and follow Chocolate on Instagram for more illustrations. And on that note, I'll see y'all next year. Party's on me.
What did you say, nigga?